So welcome everyone. Like Keisha said, it's Monday, April 21st. We've had a consistent focus over the last number of months on the question of a new global economic system. And this is something President Trump and his team are building. We've recognized comments from people like Scott Bessent, Secretary of the Treasury, Trump's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Stephen Moran, has referenced something called the Mar-a-Lago Accord. This is, of course, if you watch any financial press and media, there's a certain obsession with this in the context, especially of the tariffs, the value of the dollar. I'll touch on that more in a second. And then there's also people like J.D. Vance, who have referenced very clear and specifically the fact that globalization's embedded axiom of cheap labor, whether it was importing cheap labor through illegal migration or exporting factories abroad in search of cheap labor, that the entire system of globalization was dependent on it. So this kind of discussion, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, made specific references to a new Bretton Woods. Now, that's not something unique to our operation. In today's setting, there's a number of people, a number of economists, but if you go back to 1998, which is when I think Lyndon LaRouche first introduced this, then that's at an early stage. Since President Trump's first term, a growing number of people that are now in his cabinet or now are his advisors have come to that conclusion. And a number of many of the younger kind of Wall Street types that went into investment banking, people like Orrin Cass or Julius Crime, they've now gone and left Wall Street and set up their own think tanks, their own publications, focusing on questions of how the current economic system in various ways has failed. What LaRouche presented in 1998 was the concept of a new Bretton Woods at a time before China had been brought into the World Trade Organization. NAFTA had taken place, but what LaRouche recognized and really began his career on was that once Nixon in 1971 took the dollar off of the gold reserve standard, there was no peg of the dollar in terms of gold value, which would mean that, yes, pressure on the dollar from trade deficits would change, right? We started to accrue a trade deficit by 1970. So there was pressure on the dollar, pressure on the economic system, pressure on gold reserves in the United States. But that problem only became increasingly worse because instead of now having a focus, instead of returning to the focus in 1971 or earlier, what Mr. LaRouche had called for was as early as 1966, maybe as early as 1957, when there was a major recession in the United States, that the industrial and scientific policies of the country were failing, that we had to recommit to a massive industrialization of the United States. It's hard for us to imagine, the people of my generation, it's very hard to imagine that New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit were themselves in the city proper, in Manhattan, in the city of New York, not in surrounding areas, not just in the industrialized small towns of America. In the big cities is where our industrial powerhouse was after World War II and for 10 or 15 years. Now, we've talked about this on this show before. New York still has the same amount of people in it. About 8 million people live in New York City. The capacity to support more people has been the same since like 1960, 1950. Yet the amount of people actually working in productive areas in New York in 1960, it was 30% of the labor force. 1 out of every 8 New Yorkers, children, elderly, housewives, 1 out of every 8 worked in industrial production. That's 1 million people, 30% of the entire workforce. Places like Chicago were 40%. We're talking city proper. Los Angeles is a much bigger land area, but it still had huge industrial production, aerospace, auto. I make that point to say that as much as LaRouche was saying it and was a lone voice, it was already happening in the 1950s, in the 1960s. A de-industrialization process was already taking place. And so that was LaRouche's emphasis at that time, that the Bretton Woods system would only hold together if the United States was an industrial powerhouse. You can't have a global reserve currency. You can't have a global economic system based on the US dollar and based on the US economy if the United States is going to deindustrialize. That wasn't a phenomena that happened in 1968 with the hippies. It was something already ongoing. And the Malthusian policies were already rapidly taking hold as early as the 1940s. 1948 was the first time a major work came out pushing outright Malthusian policies that became a huge kind of bestseller. But it was already in the 1940s. So my point is that when LaRouche comes back then in 1998, about 25 years after the Bretton Woods system broke down in 1971, he called for a new system because you could see the writing on the wall. We had deindustrialized, we had opened up the financial markets, we had deregulated the financial institutions, and you are now going to this global cheap labor process, globalization. And it was going to mean an imminent crisis for really potentially every nation. Because what the underlying premise was that the major infrastructure you've built up, the major manufacturing capacities, the railroads, the roads, the factory complexes, the industrial centers, the integration of steel, of coal, of iron, of steel production into various other components, the development of the aerospace center, the development of a very integrated ecosystem for auto production. All of that took decades, if not centuries, to build up, and a skilled workforce along with it, and a social process of things like labor unions, so that when you bought an American-made Ford F-150, you were paying for your fellow Americans to have decent wages, where one person could raise a family of 5 or 6, 4 or 5 kids, have a wife stay home and build the home and build the family. And that was what was working. That was part of the labor unions and the kind of social contract we developed in this country and really in our civilization. You could look at France as another example. France was gutted in the 1970s of its industrial production, and its labor unions were broken. And that's when they built up the great famous French, welfare safety net. Now, so when LaRouche says in 1998, we're facing a crisis, he can see that this ecosystem, this century of industrial development in places like Detroit, what's already happened to a lot of the other cities like New York and Los Angeles, and what will happen to a lot of the small towns, what was already happening with NAFTA sending, jobs just below the border in the maquiladoras, where you were then just having cheap labor in Mexico at pennies on the dollar in terms of wages, is that you weren't even really building up Mexico's infrastructure. You were literally living off of the infrastructure, the power lines, the power plants, the water systems, the road systems of the United States. You were just moving the jobs just on the other side of the border. So you weren't building up the infrastructure, ecosystem, social contract in Mexico. You were just literally taking people who were desperate for work at much lower wages. That what would happen over time is that you would collapse all of that ecosystem, all of that infrastructure, because it needs constant capital reinvestment. You have to constantly rebuild that ecosystem, that infrastructure. You have to maintain that social contract. If one person reneges, walks out, in this case, the financial capital, then everybody else is just left holding the buck, or not holding the buck in this case, right? You're just left having to figure out, what do I do for work? They've just completely abandoned investing into our infrastructure, into our power systems, and into the more modern advanced factories, more modern technologies. So LaRouche recognized that there was also no basic peg to the dollar, the currency system. Others have now commented that in some sense, China came in at this point and said, we're going to peg our currency, the yuan, to the dollar. And we're going to manipulate that and keep our currency artificially low so that we can export, that our products are advantageous for other people to buy and for us to manufacture. And LaRouche saw this as a massive cheap labor agenda in China. And that it wasn't soon after 1998 that China was brought into the World Trade Organization. And literally there was now the great sucking sound really took place. I mean, entire firms. One of the ones that I always think of is Lucent Technologies. This was AT&T, but for the telecommunications and cell phone age. They built the entire infrastructure system of American cellular capabilities in the early 2000s. Literally by 2005 and 6, the company is just dismantled, destroyed, and it basically became Huawei. I mean, we have no company. Nokia, a Swedish company, now owns Bell Labs because we let the famous AT&T, which became Lucent Technologies, become just literally dismantled. So LaRouche recognized in 1998, and he talked to Bill Clinton via conduits, that we needed this. LaRouche was talking to the Russians. He was informally talking to others, people in India, had maybe networks in China. His point, though, was that you needed to now, before you unleash this madness of full-on massive dismantling of the U.S. productive manufacturing, what we now see, 90,000 factories, 5-10 million workers, but 90,000 factories. And those factories not just helped maintain cities and towns, they also were the basis for those cities, towns, and states and federal government in terms of tax revenue to build up the modern infrastructure. It was a symbiotic relationship. All of these factories, 90,000 of them, what is that, like it's almost 2,000 per state. So 2,000 more factories per state. And you've got an infrastructure ecosystem that those factories need to keep operating and keep people employed and keep the tax revenue going. So then you invest into the physical infrastructure. If they're not there, if everything's private equity and hedge funds and Wall Street, you have no longer a need nor a tax base to build up the physical infrastructure. So all of us Americans still living here end up on broken, bumpy roads, bridges that are nearly collapsing, power plants that are going to brownouts. You get the idea. So LaRouche said in 1998, we need a new system now. Of course, that doesn't happen. What did happen was what was to be expected, that the globalists moved to reorganize the political system to impose this rabidly fascist economic system. Right? Globalization is essentially universal fascism. There's no longer the nations, the nationalism, the goose-stepping. It's now corporate governance, where federal governments, national governments are weakened, but they ultimately provide the debt to fund the financial economic activity. And the whole thing is governed by corporations and the law firms that represent them. Now, how are you going to enforce that on the population? How are you going to enforce that on the American people? Well, that's what unfolded in 9/11/2001. That you saw a Reichstag fire-like incident. You saw a political action take over that implemented almost a kind of martial law, or the threat of martial law, with things like the Patriot Act. We got into the forever wars. But the federal government built up an intelligence community, a hyper-federal, privatized federal state contractors. So all of Northern Virginia boomed. Why is that important regarding a financial system? Because when 2008 financial crisis hits, when the crash hits, the threat from Dick Cheney, two members of Congress, is at least as they reported it, and it's believable given the nature of Dick Cheney, was if you don't pass the bailouts, we're going with martial law. We're going to take this domestic surveillance state, which they implemented with Trump's election 8 years later, but they thought they had the American people under control. They were abiding. Obama was the patsy. He was the blackface that came in and said, we're going bailouts, we're going fascism, we're going to add some transgender potheads to this whole picture, we're going to do more drone strikes and, color revolutions instead of these boots on the ground kind of thing. But he was fully bought in to this globalization, globalist, fascist agenda, where the national governments are now there to suppress the population, to suppress the media, to suppress the political discourse, to enforce a population accepting this kind of parasitic and fascist economic agenda. Now, the great irony is that even though China built up this massive, through cheap labor, huge amounts of cheap labor, especially in 2008, China realized this situation is now dire. We depend upon shipping all of these products to the United States. And we have a huge cheap labor population who are relatively still very poor. So China began to shift. This is where Xi Jinping comes into power about 4 years later. The process had already begun. Major internal investments into China, into its ports, its roads. They built the most advanced high-speed rail system anywhere in the world. Connects every major city of China, the most advanced technology, beautiful stations. They started taking all of these capital reserves from all of these exports, largely to the United States, and they began to invest that into the productive infrastructure environment of China. During this period, there was two competing factions. One was what we called the billionaire communists, princes of the Communist Party's founding fathers in China, sons of theirs who had risen to power, become largely very wealthy and affluent, who wanted to maintain China's cheap labor system as part of a globalist construct. There were others, though, that realized they needed to continue to invest and develop China's own capacity, kind of more of a nationalist faction in China, even a patriotic to some degree. We want to build up the strength of our own country versus these kind of billionaire communists. Let's just continue to feed off of the cheap Chinese peasants. So Xi Jinping wins that fight, and he does a huge political purge as soon as he comes into power. Just a little background into this dynamic between the US and China today. And so China continues to build up this massive infrastructure ecosystem. They're still completely wedded to globalization, to free trade, to free markets, all these kinds of epithets of the globalist system, because China has amassed a huge amount of fortune in the process. They've basically created entire companies that replaced the leading US industrial and technological firms. Lucent to Huawei is a perfect example. And they're now a rapidly advancing industrial and scientific country. That said, there is still a huge, remember, this is 1.4 billion people. It's a lot. And they have a huge affluent class, but they also have a huge middle class of like 400 million people. It also means they have 800, 700 million people in pretty severe poverty. So that's somewhat the dynamic in China today, just as kind of an overview. So they've built up rapidly. They built up this huge middle class of 300 or 400 million people. And they built up this huge ecosystem of infrastructure and production of robotics. I mean, it's really extensive if you haven't looked into it. But I say all of this to say, China has done that. No other country in the world has really done it. Japan and South Korea are a little bit unique, but most of the rest of the world has not really built up the broad-scale productive capacity. It's kind of drifted a little bit into Southeast Asia, where there have been major investments. Like Thailand has a huge auto production capacity that's been built up practically out of nothing over the last 15 years. Things you just wouldn't imagine. Thailand is the automotive productive center of Southeast Asia. But all of the manufacturing investments went to China. And China maintained an artificial system of keeping their currency low compared to the dollar. And the global financial investing class said, we're all in. We're going to put everything in China. China's the place to go. China made cheap labor, low taxes, relatively speaking. And they made it easy to do business. They built special economic zones to get this thing started in the 80s and 90s. I'm not looking to focus entirely on that, but the context, of course, is important for what we mean by a new economic system. So, and that meant that any other nation that was trying to build up manufacturing, whether it was in Mexico or Central and South America, whether it was in Africa, generally, or Europe or the United States, financial investors had no interest in investing into manufacturing firms. No capital investments into manufacturing. If you were selling raw materials, resources, if we could do some financial games, then sure, maybe. If we can do distribution so we can sell things into your country for retail purposes, fine. But there was no basis for global finance to want to invest. China became the place where that would occur. And this became a dominating trend for the last 20, 25 years. Really a great sucking sound of investments into manufacturing and production in China. And they are just the biggest producer in the world by far, comparable to what the United States was after World War II. So this is the environment Trump comes into in terms of building a new economic system. He's got to rebalance the relationship between the US and China. And what his own administration has said, Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, is that what we want China to do is focus on improving the consumption levels of that other 800 million Chinese, raise their levels of consumption, raise their standard of living. This would mean that the cheap labor policy wouldn't continue, right? They still have a large supply of very cheap labor in China for this manufacturing work. Not all of the manufacturing is cheap labor by any means. A lot of it's just gone advanced high tech, what they call dark factories. They work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with almost no people involved. It's all robotics, textiles, all kinds of things, cars. But they still have a large supply of cheap labor. And so instead of massively exporting all of this, instead of pegging these currencies low, let's improve the quality of life of all Chinese people. And let's bring manufacturing back to the United States. But the United States would ultimately be an example of what all other nations could now adopt: an internal development perspective, an industrial policy perspective, a scientific and technological policy for long-term development of their own nation. The United States would demonstrate this, and then we would build a new economic system accordingly. Okay. That's just background. What I want to now discuss is the immediate challenges that Trump is facing, because this has become a real war. But it's not a war with China, not a trade war with China or a trade war with anyone else. It is a war with globalization and the globalists. And it's a real war. It's not a shooting war, but it is very much life or death. It might not determine what language you speak, but it will determine the quality of life and the freedoms and form of government we have. The globalists are famous for saying that their system of economics is not consistent with the Constitution of the United States or the constitutions of Europe post-World War II that were explicitly anti-fascist. So they know it. The globalists know they want to impose a fascist economic system. They've looked to corrupt our government like they did with 9/11. And they want to do the same thing with other nations who resist. It's in some sense what the European Union is. So Trump launched Liberation Day and massive tariffs. Many people are debating this question. That's not the point. Trump's tariffs are going to work themselves out in negotiations. He kind of flipped over the apple cart, said, let's pick up the apples and let's get a more fair and just system here, where currencies, where debt levels, military spending, trade levels, manufacturing capacity are somewhat more balanced around the world. You have a few countries, Japan, South Korea, Germany, and China, that practically do all of the production for the world, with a little bit handed out to Mexico or Thailand or Vietnam. But it's not a sense of real nation states. It really is globalization. There's two questions Trump has to deal with in this environment. One is the international factor. And that ultimately will be China. But it's not just a question of China, it's the context that can be created for the US and China to have real negotiations. Trump knows that this is the case. China has reached out to Trump throughout the entire period between his election and inauguration. And there wasn't a lot of receptivity. Part of that is because people like Jared Kushner, who were the point person for China in the last administration, are no longer working in the administration. But part of it is, I think Trump knew that it's not a question of getting China to agree once again, like they did the last time, to buy a bunch of stuff from the United States, to buy a bunch of pork and a lot of farm products and oil and gas and this kind of thing. This is not a question of just buy what we produce. We need to rebalance and start manufacturing a lot more in the United States. This isn't just getting a trade balance, is my point. It isn't just getting rid of the deficit. It is actually recognizing that nations need a full set productive capacity. China knows this. China brags we're the only economy in the world that can produce matchsticks and rocket engines. They know they can produce everything from hubcaps to, electric cars or computer chips and whatever, and basic textiles. They produce everything in every category that's identified within international economics for productive purposes. Simple, medium, and very complex products. China produces all of it in all categories. That's what a robust industrial and manufacturing powerhouse should be. The United States, Russia, India, Europe, South America, Africa. It might be a collection of nations. It could be a general geographic area. But these should be what these continents, each continent is capable of producing internally, meeting its own internal needs from everything, from space exploration to striking a match. So Trump's looking to rebalance that because that's the basis of a stable world economic system. The economic imbalances, if they continue to grow, would lead to world war. So the first thing Trump is doing is focusing on ending the threat of world war, which is coming for the same reason 9/11 took place, which is that this system is got to be reorganized, and the globalists would like to do it. They'd like to reorganize the system based on determining national governments, controlling them, breaking them apart, extracting their resources, whatever it might be, but that they control the reorganization of the economy, not nation states, not the people's voices acting upon their leadership. This is why J.D. Vance and Trump put such pressure on the EU leaders to respond to the immigration question, because you need to start responding to your population. I mean, it's a bit bizarre, but the new chancellor of Germany has literally had two major promises: stop the immigration and not increase the debt in Germany. Two major promises to get elected. Before he's even chancellor of Germany, the leader of Germany, he's already broken both promises. I mean, that's called political failure and political collapse. I mean, these European regimes are just not long for the world. Okay, so I said Trump's first focus is to end the danger of world war. And that means brokering a deal with Russia. And we've gone through this before, but just to put it in quick summary, a deal with Russia, a real deal, which will mean both a peace agreement in Ukraine, which Zelensky is basically in a total tantrum state. We can deal with that more in questions if people are curious. But Trump remains focused on this because it's the linchpin. You get a deal with Russia, you end the danger of world war. You turn a very, very powerful enemy into a powerful ally in Putin and in Russia. And the Russians see it. The Russians have said there is common cause between the US and Russia against European fascism. Well said. That was their foreign minister, Lavrov. Well said. That's the kind of alliance that the US-Russia could represent. The United States has now, for the last 2 Saturdays, had dialogue with the foreign minister of Iran, profoundly changing. Iranians are impressed with the quality of dialogue, and that Trump is seeking a long-term agreement with Iran. That brings in India. India Vice President Vance is right now in India meeting with Modi, the prime minister. He brought his children. His wife is from Indian descent family, parents. Their children were hanging out with Modi, sitting on his lap talking to him. There's an increasing bond there. Modi wants this same type of security agreement and relationship because India needs to grow. They have severe poverty, far, far greater than China's. Once you have that, and South Korea and Japan and the ASEAN countries, which is Southeast Asia, are relatively neutral, China will come to the table. China right now is trying to do whatever it can because it has a sense of strength. It has built itself up. It took globalization, kind of judoed it, turned itself not just into a cheap labor country, but into a strong industrial and scientific country. But we all know how China did this. It was through massive investments and looting of our nation and our people by the investor class and dumping all of that investment into China. So it's like, come on here. We need a little bit of balance, and we have the right to say that. That's Trump's basic stance, and it's the right one. So the deal with Russia is critical. Everyone else will focus on what the investor class is saying. The investor class is a bunch of whiny babies. They don't really matter, but they'll dominate the headlines. They'll dominate the press. They're, screeching and screaming for attention. But the real question is you need to stabilize that relationship with Russia and build up a dynamic. Now, it's the internal question that is most challenging for Trump. The main reason for that is we are $36 trillion in federal debt, and you can probably add another $35 trillion in corporate and household debt, and there's probably another $5, $10, or $20 trillion. So at least $70 trillion of debt just in the United States. We put debt on top of everything. And so that means that the federal government has a hard time doing anything, right? Borrowing more. We have to borrow just to pay off the old debt. We have to constantly recycle it. You're not borrowing a lot of new. You're not going to do 5 trillion borrowing right now. We need 5 trillion plus of investments into the United States infrastructure if you're going to bring back manufacturing. That's the level we're talking about. Can Trump just go out and borrow 5 trillion right now? No. Can Boeing, can General Electric, Westinghouse, Intel, Ford, General Motors, can any of these companies borrow a ton of money? No, they're all overwhelmed with debt. All of the corporations are. So they have the same problem. They can't make, some of them, NVIDIA, Apple, they probably have Google. Some of the tech firms have it, but the tech firms don't employ a lot of people and don't produce squat, really. So they're mostly monopolies on advertising. So we can get some investments, but there's a debt problem. So you've got to get room to breathe. And there's not a lot of room to breathe. It's tense. So Trump has to reorganize this. That's what he's got to work on. That's what he's doing with Doge. That's what he's doing with the budget bill in Congress. But at the center of this, as you all probably already know, the center of this question is the Federal Reserve. And Trump has picked a fight, not surprisingly, with Jerome Powell, too late Powell, and the Federal Reserve. This is partly why the dollar has decreased in value, 10-year bond rates have gone up, and there's all this talk of foreigners are bailing out, foreigners are bailing out, foreigners are just sick of Trump's tariffs. Much of that is not true. Much of the panic that's leading to treasuries getting sold, lowering the dollar value, is from hedge funds in the United States who have leveraged $1 trillion or more into gambling on using treasury bonds as collateral or even betting on treasury rates. Some of that might sound like, what's he talking about? If you don't understand it, don't worry about it too much. But just take the basic fact that they're using treasury bonds and they're borrowing on top of them, or they're gambling on what the future rate will be. And they're doing it at $1 trillion level in the overnight markets. So this is a kind of dark market where insider institutions, big banks, and then some of the hedge funds that made a niche in this area came to operate. Okay. Now, I want to make this area a little bit more clear, but let me tell you why before I get into it. Trump is in a direct fight with the Fed. And so this caused me to say, well, what's actually happening with the Federal Reserve right now? Where do things stand? For many people, they have no idea how the Federal Reserve works. Now, they'll tell you, when I went to school, they told us how the Fed worked in some ways, and it's always kind of childish. But the Fed used to use this overnight market, and they would borrow money or lend money on treasuries. So if you were a bank and you wanted to borrow some money overnight at a very low interest rate, you could borrow it from the Fed as long as you had treasuries in hand. If you had $1 billion in treasuries, you could borrow $1 billion for pretty cheap. Why banks need to do that, that's all part of the banking system. It's not germane right now to us. So the Fed would control interest rates by doing this. When the financial crisis hits in 2008, the Fed opens that market up to every hedge fund imaginable in some sense. All kinds of hedge funds and others get involved. And the Federal Reserve just opens up a savings account. So that's how the Fed started to work. On its surface, how does the Federal Reserve lower or raise interest rates? Well, it raises or lowers its savings account. This is costing the Federal Reserve upwards of now $250 billion. It's not working very well. But the Fed, in some ways, you could say, is kind of bankrupt. But I say this because I want you to have a sense of how the Fed has kind of, on its surface, publicly operates. Starting with the financial crisis in 2008, and then really in 2010, the Federal Reserve decides to make a decision to operate entirely differently than even what I've just described, raising or lowering interest rates to kind of help employment and inflation. That's kind of the child book version of how the Fed operates. They decide to radically change even what that means with creating a huge balance sheet on the Fed, massively increasing the money printing. They printed huge amounts of money. They did this beginning in 2008, really took off in 2010, and then it really took off again in 2020. Let me share you my screen. The Fed. Okay, so what you're seeing right now is total assets of the Federal Reserve on its balance sheet. This means that the Federal Reserve has been buying treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. This site is called the FRED. It's the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis economic data that puts this out. And it's a very useful tool for if you ever want to do financial research on the Federal Reserve. So they tell you what they've been doing. They by law, they have to, but so you can see if you look here, 2003, 2004, 2005, the balance sheet is under $1 trillion. This is in the millions. So it's a million. So this is $1 trillion. That means that in our financial system, there was $1 trillion of currency available. Now that was multiplied, of course, through various ways, checking accounts and banks relending and so on. But we had $1 trillion of cash in the system. And this was true for a very, very long time. Look, it's very stable this entire period. And that chart could go even further backwards and it would stay a relatively slow increase of currency. Now, this is unconstitutional. No institution should have the right to just print dollars when it wants to. But we've contracted out the Fed to do that. So this is what it does. But look what happens around 2008, September. It pops up to $2 trillion. So they just doubled the money supply in the matter of a few months. And then they start quantitative easing in 2010. This means that they're just going to keep buying more mortgage-backed securities, more treasuries from the banks. So guess what? The federal government gets to create as much debt as it wants to because the Federal Reserve is now a big buyer. So they purchase between 2008, when it's at $1 trillion, And, 2015, before Trump comes in, it's at $4.5 trillion. That's $3.5 trillion of new cash. That's what happened. $3.5 trillion, 350% increase in the money supply of the country. And it was also the global financial system to some extent. But the ratio is comparable to whatever was in the United States. So 350% to 4.5. Now, when Trump comes in 2017, they start to actually raise interest rates. During this period of time, there was also an interest rate policy. I'm not going to go into that tonight. It only amplifies the problem. But when Trump comes in, they start to raise interest rates and start quantitative tightening a little bit. So the money comes down. This was meant to undercut Trump in some way. Then we get into 2019, September, and a crisis hits. The crisis that hit in September of 2019 was similar to the crisis that hit on Tuesday, April 8th, the night of Tuesday, April 8th, in the overnight market. This is when Trump had announced Liberation Day. There was a kind of growing panic, and all of a sudden there was like a treasury bond panic in the overnight market. Scott Bessent has commented directly, these were hedge funds. Yeah, it's hedge funds. They're panicking. They have $1 trillion of borrowing, and all of a sudden the markets are kind of going crazy, and these guys are kind of hanging out naked on a cliff's edge. They're just not in a good spot because they're just over borrowed, assuming that everything's going to stay exactly as it was. Anything starts to rumble or change, and these guys end up in that bad position. So that's what happened in 2019. Now, why that happened? Maybe it was because of the quantitative tightening. Maybe it was the interest rates, combination of things, but it happens. And the Federal Reserve just jumps in with like $400 billion. But then COVID hits, and look at what happens. It goes from $4 trillion on the balance sheet to $7. They increased it by $3 trillion in the matter of like 3 months. It went from doubling back in 2008 with $1 trillion to now doubling again with $3 trillion. Crazy. And then for good measure, they just keep printing more and more money up until about, the summer of 2022. They raised the balance sheet to $9 trillion. It was under 1 for the entire century. Going back to 1913, up until 2008, it was under $1 trillion. From 2008 to 2022, in 14 years, it went from $1 trillion to 9. Okay, so they then start to realize that we've got enough money now. There's so much money, they don't know what to do with it. Let me go to a different chart. This chart is this overnight market. The overnight reverse repurchase agreements. Totally technically insane language to basically say the Federal Reserve is kind of borrowing or lending money overnight to banks or hedge funds. But what Jerome Powell does, and this is too late Powell, remember he was the one raising rates on Trump, he was the one doing quantitative tightening. Yellen did it too, but Powell really did it. And he was quantitative tightening. And Powell's an institution man. This guy comes from Carlisle. He is a complete corrupt swamp globalist creature in every way. In spring of 2021, they start pulling money out of the financial market. They've printed so much, so rapidly, they don't even really need it. But he keeps doing more. He keeps doing quantitative easing. He keeps going, went from 7 trillion to 9 trillion after this point. They added 2 trillion more. But while he's adding 2 trillion more to make sure all the bankers are happy, all the hedge funds are happy, all of these globalists investing class are happy, he just keeps throwing money at them. But at the same time, he starts to pull money out, not off the balance sheet. He doesn't sell any. He's not selling anything on the balance sheet. He's not selling the mortgage-backed securities. He's just pulling some money out into this overnight kind of account, kind of a secret little account. And this secret little account goes from zero in 2021 to $2.5 trillion by the end of 2022. From zero in spring of 21, but within a year and a half, it goes to $2.5 trillion. $2.5 trillion. So he went from 7 trillion to 9 trillion on the balance sheet. Jerome Powell did. Just massive increase of money supply. But while he's doing that, he actually pulled 2 trillion into this little secret account. Now, why is he doing that? Because Jerome Powell knows I've got to, for appearance's sake, to look like a prudent banker, I've got to start doing quantitative tightening. I've got to start selling on the balance sheet. Let's go to the back to the balance sheet. Right here, in the middle of 2022, he starts to say, let's start to decrease. And he brings it down. Oh, then there's a little spike. I don't know why there's a spike there. I'm sure we could think about it and figure it out. Probably Silicon Valley Bank. I think that's what that is. March of 2023. So Silicon Valley Bank comes in, they quickly throw money back into the system, make all the bankers happy. Nobody panic. Because see, when there's a panic, everybody starts to sell. And so the Federal Reserve is saying, nobody sell. Well, there's plenty of money. If you need to borrow, if you need to cover some losses, you need to roll over some debt, because everybody's got huge amounts of debt. There's plenty of money to borrow at low rates. So don't sweat it. You don't need to sell off your assets to pay your debts. You can borrow. There's plenty of money. But he reduces it all the way down to where it is today, to 6.7 trillion. So he knocked off 2.3 trillion from the balance sheet. He's the prudent banker. I'm going back to quantitative tightening. We're going to get the Fed in good shape. We're going to get that back down to $1 trillion and so on. Now he stopped doing that. There's no more quantitative tightening. That stopped at the beginning of this month. But think about, while he's so-called doing quantitative tightening, what's he doing with all of this money he's got in this secret account, the reverse repo account? Nobody's really maintaining that. No one's watching that. The American people aren't watching this, but it's the game these people play. Well, in December of 2022, it hits a peak. And then what happens? He starts lending that money back out into the system. So even though you think that $2.5 trillion have come out of the system, Jerome Powell is making sure everybody knows there's plenty of money. There's plenty of money. There's plenty of money. We're going to keep lending this out. Each month, each week, each day, there's going to be money in that overnight process. Until, wait a minute. What's happening here? The account's running out. It's going dry. Well, we've stopped quantitative tightening. So we're not going to be selling anything off the balance sheet anymore. And when they sell off the balance sheet, the Fed brings in money and then puts that money away. They write off the asset. They're taking money out of the financial system by doing so. It was on Thursday, April 17th, this account was down to $58 billion. So from $2.5 trillion a couple of years ago, $2.5 trillion to now $50 billion. The Federal Reserve has run out of money to keep all of these hedge funds and all of these gambling operations of the globalist investors happy. And he can't do, so the question is, how is he going to put more money into the system? The bankers are starting to demand more money. Prior to the tariffs, prior to China's DeepSeek AI algorithm, which created a panic for NVIDIA and the big tech companies. But Trump is, before all of that, this problem was already taking place. And all of these hedge funds and all of these other firms and private equity firms have, if they're over leveraged, and many of them are in a crisis. So what I'm presenting is the kind of since 2008, the Federal Reserve started to operate totally differently. And there's been a game involved. That game hit a bump in the road in 2019, and the Fed just threw in $400 billion. Jerome Powell just did it. When the COVID lockdowns are implemented, then Jerome Powell set up all kinds of special new financial vehicles in Delaware. I mean, it was crazy what they were doing. Jerome Powell would like to do something similar today. There is clearly another financial crisis, a liquidity crunch, a kind of problem because they need more money to keep their assets going, to keep their debt rolled over. If they can't roll over their debt at low interest rates, even if their interest rates just stay at 4%, which is high, and there could be a problem just in that process alone, like with Silicon Valley Bank. But it's a liquidity crisis. We need more money into the system. We saw when Silicon Valley Bank went under, they jumped quantitative easing back $200 billion. Well, Trump is saying, you know what? Every time you do that, you are stealing from the future. You're creating the conditions of massive inflation. And then what Biden, of course, did was spend into the American people and just jacked up prices. Federal spending just created this took all of this money that had been created and all of this debt and then created an inflationary dynamic. There's ways that the Federal Reserve has controlled this to avoid consumer price inflation. So eggs didn't skyrocket since 2008 or 10. Automobiles or other things didn't skyrocket, but housing did, healthcare did, education did. A lot of things did go up like crazy. But they've maybe had ways of controlling it otherwise. Part of that was because if production is overseas, then the production process of goods is not affected by this crazy inflation. So you can see how globalization has been structured. Trump knows that this is the racket. Bessent knows this is the racket. Howard Lutnick ran Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald was one of the top primary dealers for the Fed. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, knows how this racket works. They know it. They were just on the other side of the team, and they were making billions of dollars off of this racket. Now they're on the side of the American people with President Trump, but they know how the racket works. They know Jerome Powell's stuck in a bind. They want a Federal Reserve chairman that's going to work with the administration to now tell Wall Street banks, you guys have tons of cash on hand, upwards of $6 trillion of cash on hand. But they don't want to lend it to these stupid, risky hedge funds. That's what happened in September of 2019. The bank said, no, we don't want to lend to you freaks and hedge funds anymore. So they just sat on piles of cash. Trump knows that pile of cash has to get into the real economy. He needs a coherent policy and team, not somebody like Powell that wants to blame the financial crisis that's brewing. I don't know when it's going to happen. I'm not making predictions here. I'm not making investment advice. I'm saying clearly there are circumstances where this game has to continue to play out from the standpoint of Jerome Powell and the crazy Wall Street types. And Trump is saying no. Powell's saying, well, then I'm going to blame the system crisis on you. I'm going to blame it on your tariffs. I'm going to say your tariffs were inflationary. He went to the Economic Club of Chicago and said, Trump's creating this problem. There's inflation. The tariffs are disruptive. It's a lot of uncertainty. Blame on Trump. So Trump just comes back, as Trump does, and says, absolutely not. Jerome Powell's the problem. He should lower the rates. He should lower the rates and take the edge off a little bit. Trump wants time. He wants a cooperative Federal Reserve, which is unconstitutional on its face. He wants a cooperative team that will create an ability to navigate this tension as you reorganize the economy, not around Wall Street, but around Main Street, but not just Main Street like small consumers or small shops. Production, industry, infrastructure, power supply. We need to pull that $6 trillion that banks don't lend anymore. What is JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs do? They gamble, they bet, they invest with that money. They don't invest it into manufacturing firms. Only in China would they do that. That's what China was for. We don't do that here in the United States. The regulations, the cost of labor, the corruption, the EPA, you don't get anything done. We're not going to invest in here. I mean, on that side, Wall Street, they're a little bit smarter than the average person in that sense. So Trump is saying, look, but we've got to create an environment where investment can work. And then we've got to strong arm these banks to start investing, not give them a more bailout, not continue this financial racket. And that's the war with Jerome Powell. That's the crux of this domestic fight, because you can't set up a new global economic system if you have this corruption in your own house. It's like telling everybody, wagging your finger and saying, stop the drug use, stop the prostitution, stop the gambling. But in your own house, you've got, everybody's doing those things. Trump has to clean this up. He's got to stop putting the investor class first and everybody else last. Now, and that doesn't mean major stock market losses, but it probably means some course correction. As Peter Navarro has said, instead of having the S&P 500 index be going up because of 7 companies, why don't we have like 400 of the 500 companies who are manufacturing firms that they're going up? That would be a better way of having, stock market growth. The point is, you've got to get that money that has been created. This is real potential credit, not just cash, not just money, but potential credit in the banking system that's been created since 2008, that has not gone into infrastructure, has not gone into manufacturing, has not gone into industry. It's gone into an investor financial racket. And Powell wants to bail it out again, or he wants to blame the crisis on Trump. Trump is directly opposing and fighting that, and he's got a very skilled team doing it. So we should back Trump up, back up the tariffs, back up the negotiations with Russia, and hopefully now you have a better sense of maybe the battlefield we're engaged in. So that's what I wanted to present tonight, a little bit longer than usual, but I think hopefully you found it important and useful to your understanding. And so on that, Keisha, why don't I wrap it up and see if we have any questions or discussion from the audience tonight.
Okay. Yes. Let's bring people in. So if you are wanting to ask a question or make a comment, press *9 on the phone line to unmute, to raise your hand, and *6 to unmute yourself. When I call in you, please tell us your first name and the state you're calling. You can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen as well. Let's see what we got.
Yeah, let's see what we got. And just for purposes, I'll put those websites. People want to look at them. I'll put them in the chat. Keisha, if you want to just bring somebody in, we can get started with the discussion.
Who's speaking?
This is Eric, North Hollywood.
Hey, Eric, what's going on?
Eric, I am really, really excited about hearing the Secretary of the Treasury talking seriously about Bretton Woods. To me, this is significantly huge. And I would just like to hear a little bit of open discussion about how, for those that aren't really upbeat on it, and he didn't live back when we had Bretton Woods before, how this would put millions of people back to work in America and around the world. I think that's a very worthwhile thing to explore.
Yeah, well, the most important is, and Scott Besant's an interesting guy. I mean, he was somebody that worked for George Soros. He works in an area known as macro analysis, which is basically looking at how governments and nations and the global economy are interacting. So he knows the big picture well, and he's actually taught courses on current, Bretton Woods, post-World War II economic structures. So he's invested time and research into these questions. Eric, I'm just going to mute you because there's a lot of background on your microphone. Okay, great. You did it yourself. Thanks. So Besson is well prepared for this. The biggest factor of what a real Bretton Woods is, in terms of basic components, the main focus, as I've stressed, is the industrial orientation, that the United States leads that and then it allows other nations to. Tony Papert did the discussion last Monday, and he talked once again about how we helped build up the steel industry in Brazil during World War II. And it was this kind of investments that the United States was making in Brazil, in Mexico, in the Americas, that was going to help develop a strong and sturdy civilization in the Americas. After World War II, we didn't keep up this kind of investment, but a critical component to this kind of investment were stable exchange rates. If you're going to invest long-term, if you're a bank or if you're a export-import bank, like a national governmental lending institution for exports and imports, something like that, and you want to make an investment into Brazil's or Argentina or Mexico, because you see that there's a profitable, good economic basis to do so. But if Scott Besson and his George Soros team can manipulate currencies like Soros did in Thailand or Malaysia or Mexico, then you unmine that investment long term, because you don't have stable rates, unlike what China did, which is to keep their rate artificially low but stable. They kept it stable. That made investments into China much more long-term viable. You have to create that kind of condition for other nations around the world. How you manage that can be complicated, but the core of it, the core compromising point of why it broke down after World War II by 1971 was because the United States had not maintained an industrial orientation. It de-industrialized. It went Malthusian. It went globalist in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and then it spread to the other cities. And that's the problem. That was the great compromise, the great sin that led us to this point where we are today. And so Trump's got to set that basis. And that's why the currency question cannot be in the hands of the Federal Reserve. You can't have stable exchange rates that are reasonable between the United States and other countries, and then have this cracked out Federal Reserve guy throwing just trillions of new dollars into the system based on, some hedge funds in a panic. F them. If the Dow Jones goes down 5%, most people, especially most people under 50 in this country, it doesn't change their life at all. The biggest impact it probably has are people that are already retired who think of the stock market as their savings account. But for most people, that's not affecting their daily lives. But investments into infrastructure, investments into manufacturing, investments into energy and power supply, building new cities, building up the old cities, getting our industry going again, those things have an immediate impact on the daily lives of the majority of the American people, of course, especially those still working. So that's the main component. Internationally would be that fixed exchange rate or a stable exchange rate system. So I appreciate the question. Eric, does that help answer what you were thinking, or did you want to say more? Eric, you still there? You got to unmute.
Yeah, it can't help, Mike. I appreciate hearing all of it.
Great. Absolutely. Let's make it happen. So like you said, if you haven't asked a question before, feel free to jump in. We'll try to take as many as we can tonight.
Hello, Keisha and Mike. I'm Betty Plummer. I'm Daphne, Alabama. My question is, could you discuss the LaRouchian efforts to industrialize America 2.0 and industrialize the states and get people working in relation to what you just talked about with this? It sounds like creation of money out of thin air. And
Well, yeah. So there's two factors. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It doesn't have a apparent basis to me as to how that is done. It's just
Yeah. Well, that's the problem here is in how this whole thing has been working these last 17 years with the Fed, with the bailouts, has just made it far more insane than it ever was before. I mean, part of the argument and part of the problem is oftentimes, and this will surprise a lot of Americans today, given the insanity of the Federal Reserve has printed $8 trillion extra that we didn't have in 2008, just in the last 17 years. But for most of human history, the problem has been not enough money circulating. That what happens is that without enough money circulating, that the ability to borrow, the ability to do farming, to sow your seeds in the spring, to hire labor, to get equipment, and to harvest and transport that harvest in the autumn and move it around. These kinds of things were always restricted because there just wasn't enough currency, or there wasn't enough currency in the pockets of the average person. This happened in the 20s and 30s, where food prices were plummeting, that farmers weren't recouping enough money to go back and farm the next year. So that you had to have more money into the pockets of people, just to in the pockets of actually the average working class, to raise the rates for basic commodities like food or energy, to be profitable for the producers who are engaged in it. This is somewhat the pressure of where the Fed comes from. There was such a pressure on not having enough consistent liquidity introduced that the bankers on Wall Street decided to co-opt the idea of a national bank, a bank that's set up by the government to specifically lend effectively to businesses, not to function and serve Wall Street's speculative investments, but to serve physical investments into industry and production. Because that's where you want the liquidity to go. When it doesn't go there, then you get bubbles, you get asset bubbles. That, it's kind of like, a cotton bubble or a housing bubble. That phenomena kept happening because there wasn't a kind of a control of things. Now, our version of American System 2.0 and the pamphlet and how we look at this is the real challenge now is to take this $6-7 trillion. Literally, $6 trillion is sitting in cash funds, money market accounts. That means very short-term treasuries, just making a little bit of money because the big banks and other, Black Rocks and other private equity funds don't really know what to do with all the money that they have. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but that they're sitting on so much cash and they don't see a way to make that profit off of it. So the point is that one, you have to make an environment that can be productive. You've got to strip the regulations out. You've got to strip away this perspective. And you've got to create an environment where then investments can start to be made to get manufacturing companies that can be productive and profitable and get them lending. Trump wants to strong arm them. He set up something when he signed an executive order to open up mining and minerals in the Western states. And he called it like the National Capital Forum. And it was specifically that the Secretary of Defense, because for our defense measurements, and the Commerce Secretary and these guys would have the power to go strong arm banks and private equity firms and you are going to be investing into these areas or you're probably not going to be operating much longer. I mean, he doesn't say it that way. I'm a little bit tongue in cheek, but the point is that these are national necessities. We need these. These are strategically critical for the survival of the country. You guys need to be investing. We'd like you to help us out and make some investments into these areas. So, because they're just sitting on piles and piles of cash, create some incentives, create some tax breaks, do everything you can to make investments into some of these productive areas. Once you get that moving, the real American System 2.0 question takes off. Because what huge manufacturing complexes need is remarkably advanced infrastructure. This is what China figured out post-2008 especially. And they've built up this So now China says, we're not just cheap labor. We've got the most, in all the investor class says it too. China has the most advanced productive system in the world. They do. That's why Apple likes it. That's why all these companies like it. They've created this huge, built out, remarkable ecosystem of infrastructure. So we basically have to do the same thing. And we have to do it with a long-term perspective using the most advanced technologies to build up our transit system, industrial rail. You can also do high-speed rail for commuter services because you just have people moving around a lot more, doing business and activity. We need huge power plants. We need consistent water supply. You're going to need water supply in the western states. We've got ways of solving that. So once you get the manufacturing going and you have that long-term tax base that will support the towns and cities, support the states, support federal investments, Trump will then, and you have a really rapidly growing economy. Our economy can grow at 5, 6, 7%. That's what China was doing that whole period. They were growing at 6, 7, 8%. That's what India is now doing today. When you get that kind of growth, that's going to give Trump the room to really get rid of the deficit, start paying off the debt, and create an ability to say, we now need to reinvest. The process is now moving. It's got a momentum of its own to pay off the debt, but to really make this work and to create an ecosystem for these productive firms to really flourish and to become global world-class producers. We need a world-class productive ecosystem. We need to build the infrastructure, the ports, the roads, the water, the locks and dams and gates of our waterways. We need to create that kind of productive ecosystem. And so then you start to look at what kinds of major infrastructure investments need to get going. And those infrastructure investments ultimately parallel with the development of potentially new cities. This is where, Las Vegas, Boulder, Colorado explicitly comes from the Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam. But when you're building big infrastructure, that takes 10 or 15-year projects to build. You create cities, you start to build new habitats, new locations for people, you build housing, you build infrastructure, because you got to support the labor supply to build these projects. So that really is where the American system comes in. And in some sense, right now we're just dealing with so much. We've had an 800% increase in the money supply. The real question is getting this directed in the right direction. We don't need to worry about really creating a lot more. Maybe at some point we will. Or not a lot more, but maybe we'll need more at times. And that should be done by Congress. And that's part of the American system, is that Congress can see we're facing a liquidity crunch, that producers, manufacturers, industrial firms are finding that the rates to borrow are too high. There's just not enough lending capacity. The bank reserves are not too full. We need more money into the system. And so you can introduce new currency as credit. The Congress can issue it, and it can be directed by the Treasury towards, say, a large-scale set of projects. So you don't just throw the money into Wall Street and say, do whatever you want with it, guys, have fun, which is what the Fed does. Congress can issue new credit as currency, as credit, because it'll be lent to firms who are going to build. So today we might want to build, or say like in 10, 15 years, we want to build 40 nuclear fusion power plants. We've now got a commercial plant design. It's ready to go. We want to build a lot of them. They're very capitally expensive. We've got firms who want to do it, but they need very, very good lending rates. Okay, you need great rates? Well, guess what? We're going to give you 0% rates for 40 years. And Congress is going to issue that new currency, and it's going to come from the Treasury. It's going to go out to some local banks. It's going to go to these firms, and they're going to build these 40 fusion plants. So the introduction of money can happen, in some sense, needs to happen out of thin air, but you're borrowing from the future to do it. Always. You're always borrowing from the future to do it. It's like creating debt. The point of the American system is that if you're going to borrow from the future, you better build something for the future.
Amen.
And that's the principle of credit in a constitutional form. It would be lent out to these firms, and then that would increase the overall borrowing and liquidity in the system as a whole. So, and if you're constantly doing that, if you're measuring and monitoring the business activity, and you're also seeing a need for a new infrastructure platform before the, liquidity crunch or inability for a business to function because there's not enough flow of currency, you really should have already pre-seen that we need a new infrastructure platform. We need to scientifically and technologically advance our productive system. Let's make sure that happens. And by doing so, the money you're introducing is going to gain real value because you're not just making more strawberries, you're transforming how the entire system produces. And that's really at the core of what an American system process would be like building the Transcontinental Railroad. It never existed before. It opened up California and Oregon and Washington and the whole Western states to all new kinds of potentials. And so that kind of investment has a different value. But anyway, that's a lot, but that would be at least the way I would address what you were asking, Betty.
Well, thank you, Mike.
If I may, let me just say also another subject that's come up in this discussion is the labor force and how you're going to advance the workforce. And I was just reading, there's in the Substack, Brian Lance, one of our collaborators, writes a lot on economics, has written books on this, just wrote a report, an article on our workforce, a sleeping giant. Because I think the key is once you start to develop where the credit is going to go into advanced manufacturing, you have to start to look at what is it going to take to rapidly advance your workforce, where for many years with the post-industrial society, we have moved people toward the gig economy, toward the unproductive work, service economy. And so one of the areas in terms of the workforce where he says you have a certain sleeping giant is in the defense industry and also military, where a lot of these people are being trained in working in the nuclear industry, working in industrial development. But you would have to start to use the role model, if you will, of the community colleges or what you're seeing in some return in some high schools and other places now, where instead of having your workforce or people go back to 4-year university systems, you would have them in rapid training in terms of these trade schools, technical development, so that they can be put out there into these projects. Because most people, you have people like Janet Yellen and others now who are saying, well, American people are not into manufacturing. They're not into wanting to work in these industrial jobs. And so therefore you're going to have to bring people in from outside of the country or cheap labor, slave labor or something. But the reality is that it goes back to the development of your home system, the family, the nuclear family, as you were talking about, Michael, where people can earn an income on one income to sustain a family, and this whole question of what is our labor force, where it exists, how do we rapidly advance it, where is it going to come from, how do we transition and shift from this service-based economy to a productive economy. And the way we think about manufacturing today, I had a conversation with Brian, is going to be completely different from, say, what we were doing in the 1930s and 40s. It'll be a new style of a CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps or Space Conservation Corps, because now you've moved into more advanced manufacturing, from your CNC machines, your AI development, and the idea of how you would increase your innovation and creativity in your workforce is going to be used by very different in terms of the process of how we train in manufacturing today. So I think the question came up before on the idea of where is the labor force going to come from? How are we going to train that labor force? And once you have, as you discussed, the credit and the funding that's going away from the market economy into the productive economy, which Trump is calling for, then you're going to have to do some rapid training programs and training schools, technical education schools, and so forth for getting people really equipped for an advanced workforce.
That's great. Betty, did you have anything else you wanted to follow up with?
Yeah, I do not. I don't know if you can hear me. No.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for getting on tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Keisha, we got a couple questions here. One from Gerald. Well, one Dennis Dugan from via Gerald, and then one from Richard McAllister.
This is in the chat. I don't see those.
It's in the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
You want me to read it, or do you want you want to? Yeah. So the Gerald one is halfway down. It starts with the quote.
Okay. Got a call. Dennis Dugan from Arizona.
It says, Mike, can some of the debt? Just halfway down at the quote.
Okay, sorry about that. Mike, can some of the debt be converted to share in a national bank as Alexander Hamilton created, and then the debt can become an asset because the debt will be productively invested by such a bank? Do you think this makes sense?
Yeah, it totally could. I mean, you just mentioned Brian Lance in his book. He's also promoted or recognized that the sovereign wealth fund that Trump is setting up could also be something where people could convert their treasury bonds into shares of the sovereign wealth fund so that they could become investors in the fund. They would reap benefits from the fund in terms of derivatives. Or they could set up a national bank to do the same thing, but you could basically extinguish the debt by making it into the ownership of the sovereign wealth fund or national bank, and then in return, people would get shares, so they would benefit off the long-term development of the country or the long-term development of that investment fund, which I think will be predominantly based on investments in the United States. How this all works out, but that's possible, that you can you can give people a better lucrative offer than just a treasury bond to help reduce the debt. They say, look, you can be now an owner in the sovereign wealth fund or in a national bank. So that could totally work. A big thing Trump wants to do with the debt is right now a lot of it's in this 6-month range where people are buying a 6-month treasury. And Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is really, I think, working hard to improve the 10-year and 30-year bond sales. The most recent auction that he held, a lot of the foreign buyers were very involved in the 10-year and 30. I think Trump is talking to these nations. That's something he wants them to do. They want to get out of this short-term debt cycle. They want to get it out to 30-year or longer even. They might start offering 40 or 50-year bonds. We'll see. Those are some of the options they have. But they want to stretch out the debt and then let people, and so they have some room to play with some short-term debt. So they can do 5-year infrastructure bonds. They could do some other things to move the process. But a big question right now is putting enough adequate pressure. It's the honey and the stick. It's creating an environment where productive manufacturing can take place in the United States, the regulations, the taxes, the investment process, and then creating a strong stick to get these banks on Wall Street to say, you're now going to be part of the United States and you're going to invest into the reindustrialization. That's the biggest challenge. But certainly the ability to eliminate some of the debt could happen that way. So hopefully that answers the question, Dennis. If it doesn't, you can have Gerald text me or put another note. You want to read the question from Richard?
Do all roads lead to higher wages, both in the U.S. and globally? Is higher wages the magic lever that makes inflation more bearable and generally swaps prosperity between Main Street and Wall Street? Focus on the average worker while still inflating away the debt.
Yeah, and I think that's the assumption. So Richard's asking, can Trump all he has to do is create higher wages for the average American, and then all of this money printing from the Fed could either be kind of zeroed out, it won't have the effect that it's had. I don't think, it's one way of putting it. I don't think it's wrong. If you can distribute, it's more, the problem with economics is you get into these models of these simple trade-offs. One, I don't think Trump wants to continue to inflate away the debt. He wants to be able to pay off the debt by real profits, which is different. It's a very, very big difference. It's the right way. You want to actually get the nation profitable. The nation as a whole should be profitable enough to pay off its debts. And once that starts to happen, once there's not a deficit, once there's a surplus in the budget on an annual basis, some of it comes from tariffs, some of it comes from other areas. But once you have a surplus and you're paying off the debt, then that debt becomes very fungible and the debt becomes an asset. But to do that, and to do that in a sustained way, means creating investments today that will last 50 to 100 years, investments into real deep infrastructure for industrial production, building the new, Trump wants to revive U.S. shipbuilding. You're going to need entirely new modern shipbuilding ports to do this. You're going to have to invest into that infrastructure. So there's going to be things in every industrial area, that same type of equipment and infrastructure and investments are going to be required. Trump wants to get the physical process as a whole profitable. And then he knows that ultimately we can bring prices down, not just inflation down, right? Inflation down means having lower rates of prices go up. We can bring prices down. Prices of housing can come down. Now, that might scare a lot of retirees today, but for anybody under 40, they're like, really? Prices could come down? So the point is that we can actually create a process. It doesn't mean the homes won't have value in them. It just means that the overall pricing for people to get into housing will start to improve. Their incomes will go up and prices will stabilize. They'll come down a little bit. It will start to work where the dollar, your dollar in this country, will actually increase in value over time. You'll be able to essentially buy more with it, either better quality product for the same price or more of it and so on, because our production is going up and real incomes have gone up. And I think that's
the wages from the standpoint of he's increasing the living standard of the population, because it's the case that you would have higher wages so that people can pay for higher prices, or are you going to have increases in wages because you had a different level of productivity and production and work in the population? Trump has also mentioned the idea of lowering the taxes, and lowering the taxes because it'll be offset by tariffs. But do you really need to say that in order to deal with the inflation, the only way you're going to deal with that is to increase the wages so that people can pay for the higher cost of things?
Mm.
Yeah, do you actually change the standard of living?
Yeah, you want to get the nation profitable, and then you can get households profitable. That households are running a surplus, that they're actually seeing that they're able to build a bigger home, they're able to raise a bigger family, They're able to meet the cost. They're actually able to there's a higher savings rate in the United States. And you want that savings rate. The key point, though, that's right, is you want that, like, let's take savings rate, what each household is putting away every month or every year. You want that increasing across the board. And what that means is that you have an increased political stability. You have people who are working class, who are under the 50, the median income. Household income is under the median. They're below the basic average, but they're saving money because their expectations in life are maybe less than others, but they're able to buy a home in a working class neighborhood. They're putting money away, their savings, and that creates an ability for them to be engaged a little bit more in politics. It means that the whole population is a little bit more capable of getting engaged in the political direction of the country. They're contributing to candidates. They feel a flexibility. They feel a need to keep that system going. There's a different kind of engagement from the population. When you have 50, 60%, 70% of your population with barely any savings, except, a 401k in the markets.
And that's not even savings to put into a Roth IRA or a SEP account or something. That's just savings so that if you have an emergency that comes up, it's nothing. It's not like, it's like the average household savings is like $50,000. It's not a lot. And then people have money in the market. And I think people today, because they say 60% of the American people are invested to some degree in the market. I think for a lot of people, they feel like the one place they've made a little profit in the last 10, 15 years is in the market. They've gotten screwed everywhere else. Their property taxes are going up. Their houses are falling in disrepair. Any kind of repairs or additions are really, really expensive. Car prices have gone up. Gas prices have gone up. Medical prices have gone up. They just feel squeezed in every direction. Their income is not meeting it. But the one place they're making a buck is the market. Because even under Biden's disastrous regime, the market went up 20% year after year. That's what Wall Street thinks. It's got everybody addicted to this. Trump is putting a cold bucket of water on it. He says people need to sober up. We need to look at this with a real perspective and focus on the real economy. What Trump's telling Powell is the real economy is doing better. Employment's up. Manufacturing's up. We lost 100,000 manufacturing jobs during Biden. Under Trump, in the first few months, we're already up tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs. A complete reversal. The physical economy is doing better. Gas prices are low. Food prices are low. Things are better. At least there's a relief. And Powell's saying, oh no, everything's looking really bad. Trump's like, are you out of your mind? Just because the market's shaky, the average person is dealing with a better quality of life. Trump's polling shows that this is true. He's got the support of the American people because they feel a better economy. They feel a better reality. But we've got a long ways to go. This war with the Fed, this war with this whole financial system is huge. So, but that's at least there's a positive. We got one more question. Should we take that and wrap it up? Question in the queue.
Someone's got their hand raised. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That. Hello. Hi, this is Dawn.
Hey, Doris, before you jump in here, let me just take one question because I don't want it to be the last thing I comment on. Okay. An anonymous attendee says, if Trump avoids the economic fascism, will he avoid also the practical fascism, like people being disappeared to the El Salvadorian concentration camp without due process? Okay, so people have all heard about this story of Abrego Garcia. He's a guy in Maryland who had a wife, and they have 3 kids. All of them have like autism. And so the media turned this into a huge sob story. The guy was here illegally. His wife filed domestic abuse charges against him, said he was incredibly violent and destructive and didn't want him anywhere near her. She does happen now to have a GoFundMe account because of all the media attention she's gotten of over $200,000 though. He was also found to have MS-13 tattoos on his hands. He was caught and arrested hanging out with other MS-13 known gang members wearing MS-13 gang attire, really unusual attire. It's not like it was just a black hoodie. It was specific imagery. But he also has tattoos. And then he was stopped for a traffic violation in Tennessee without a driver's license with 7 other guys driving from Texas who all had the same address. So he's clearly involved in human smuggling. He's a domestic abuser. He's directly affiliated with a gang. He came here illegally, and he was sent back to El Salvador. Now, I don't like the idea of anybody just be sent into a prison without having been convicted of a crime. The reason people are being sent to that prison in El Salvador is because in many cases, for the Venezuelan gang members like Tren de Aragua, they are not able to send back to Venezuela. But President Trump made it very clear, and the media has broadcast this out. If you're a member of MS-13, if you're a member of Tren de Aragua, if you're a member of some of the other Mexican cartels, you are now members of foreign terrorist organizations. You can be incarcerated by your membership in that organization. You do not have to have committed a crime to now be a criminal because of direct association with those affiliates. So that probably means that either you need to get some tattoos removed, you need to go into the FBI or police department and say, I'm no longer affiliated, I'm leaving the country, I'm deporting myself, I came here illegally. That's the only way. That's what Trump is asking. Leave the country, leave now, let us know you're leaving, and you can get back in the line to come back into the country. And anyone participating in these gangs is going to be shipped out, possibly to an actual prison. Now, is that nice or sweet? No. But is Abrego Garcia Jean Valjean from the Victor Hugo Les Miserables novel? No, he's not a poor guy. He's not a poor American who was arrested because he was stealing bread because his children were starving. That's not this story. It's not some romantic story of, fighting the corrupt government of some hardworking guy. We have a massive problem in this country from illegal immigration, and Trump is saying, leave now, you shouldn't be here. And if you are involved in gang and criminal activity or the cartels and human or drug trafficking, get the hell out of the country. And if you don't, you will be arrested and put in prison. And that's the best way to get them to leave. Trump's also dealing with 500,000 minors who have been trafficked. The Biden administration was so egregious on this, it would hand over 14-year-old girls to a guy who said he was her brother. When he wasn't, they did no genetic check, they did no evaluations, no validations of that familial tie. And so you were literally trafficking children, and the government was handing them over to the men who would then be raping and impregnating these girls. That's the system the federal government was involved in, let alone all the crimes and injuries and murders and rapes that took place by people just on the streets. So people can have a sob story because the media tried to turn this into the great Jean Valjean, the guy that was put into false prison, or the Count of Monte Cristo. He was politically persecuted and put into an unjust prison. Great novels, great movies, great literature, not the reality today. And so I would just ask that person to do a little bit more research. And for anybody who wants to know on this stuff, do some research. But this stuff I'm documenting from Tennessee, the domestic abuse has all come out over the last week. And so, I was concerned too. It's like, did some guy that really was just a decent guy get sent to an El Salvadorian prison? So I'm understanding people questioning it. It's just what's come out has been very clear and important. So I would encourage anybody, including this anonymous attendee, to look into it. Okay, Doris, now your chance to go ahead.
All right. I wanted to ask about the efforts that we are promoting, I guess, that the manufacturing is necessary, needed. What I'm trying to say is that manufacturing and industry pull right old words from a former age compared to what we are trying to do, or at least what's been, what we dreamed about on these calls. And I just wondered like with the discussion of China and thinking about how American consumers have purchased other things that have been exported. And I have visitors of many people, houses in America, full of things that they've purchased, but it's nothing that made like the country advance for the future, because you described like the falling down houses and the bridges and things like that. I just was wondering if you could relate, I guess, agreeing to where we're trying to engage people and practical needs. If you could comment, if I'm making myself clear, I would just like to say, for instance, I liked how they had a little chance to see some of the drawings that Lyndon LaRouche, the Vinci, drew, and I'd like to know where to see more of those pictures. But one of the things he had was flying machines, and it seemed like individual persons that we call.
They're building those today, yeah.
What about us having, instead of cars, why don't we have flying machines?
Yeah, they are. That's the next kind of product and consumer. I mean, there's obviously going to be some danger and that has to be worked out, but the product is already in the market and it's getting tested, and it's partly needs, a federal aviation approval on some of this stuff. But it's in the works. It's definitely in the works. Like the big thing is that so much of economics has become about consumer orientation and consumer products. And 10% of the American population consumes 50% of all American consumption. And 20% consumes like 62%, 63%. So, you go 30% consume 70-something percent. So 70% of the population is consuming 30% of what the nation consumes. So one, you're not even measuring per household consumption effectively. You're looking at these exorbitant consumption levels of very, very affluent families who have been made affluent by $8 trillion of new cash pumped into the system and largely handed to their sources of profession. They were in finance, they were in Wall Street, they were in some area where the money flowed, well, and during this period. And so their consumption levels are just exorbitant. They'll buy cars, they'll buy houses, they'll buy toys, they'll buy gadgets. They're spending on these luxury resorts that just seem way overpriced for anything you get. They're going to restaurants constantly and spending huge amounts of money at restaurants that are just excessive. Where most Americans, the 50, 60, 70% of Americans consuming 30% are cooking at home, buying food, complaining about prices in the groceries, maybe go out once a week, don't take a big vacation, maybe go to the lake, go to a cabin, that kind of thing. A lot of people go to Vegas because the hotels are cheap. The question of economics in this modern period, once you've met the basic thresholds of food availability and housing and electricity and so on, is what are you building for the next generations? Right? When you have to work for food, if you don't work, you literally don't eat, which is the condition for most of mankind up until the early 20th century, then you didn't necessarily think about what you handed to the future generations, except that you raised them and fed them and gave them a chance to also work and have the skills and knowledge to do so. And hopefully have a culture, have a worldview, have a sense of their relationship to the creator and creation, the moral dignity of culture that was developed even on a basic, peasant level. These conceptions were just incredibly important and profound. And that was what you were creating. Culture today, what we hand our children, cannot simply be the ability to know how to farm, basic skill set, and a kind of a cultural worldview that, as profound as it is, was also somewhat simple. Now the world is very complex. We have to build and demonstrate to the younger generations how you build a viable, vibrant, beautiful civilization based on the level of technology we've developed. Not consumer products that can brainwash them with smartphones, or just kind of inundate them with information. But what about building the beautiful infrastructure, beautiful transit systems like high-speed rail, beautiful cities, remarkably advanced energy productive systems, building something where life is kind of remarkably, that instead of knowing how to farm effectively, how to raise pigs or raise sheep or raise cattle and grow peas or potatoes or corn or wheat and build buildings and do masonry and all the things that you might have to do on a farm in the 19th century, make clothes and so on, spool wool, things that farmers and farm families did. I mean, hard work. The hard work today is much more, do we have the can we take the responsibility to make sure that the institutions of our society are building up the infrastructure so that this society continues to function at a higher level for more people in the coming generation, for my grandchildren's generation. That's what we didn't do, right? What we did in the 1960s was say, you know what, all this infrastructure that we built up, electricity, hydroelectric, the dams, the water systems, the water supply, the highways under Eisenhower, we started to pull down the railroads, but all the railroads we built from the 19th century, the railroads, the water systems, the locks and dams on the rivers, the ports, the shipping, all that infrastructure we built, we said in around 1968, 1970, you know what? Why do we don't need to build any more of that? We can just go with what we have. And we literally have just lived with what we have. Some places have gotten more affluent, Phoenix or the Bay Area or Austin, Texas or Tampa, Florida have a bunch of money so they might have built some better highways and cleaner and newer or something. So the infrastructure might feel a little bit better down there, but ultimately a lot of it's brand new. Like versus the stuff in Detroit is just completely broken down, or New York, it's just totally broken down. It's crazy because it was built 100 years ago. We just stopped building and renewing and investing, as if somehow we could completely ignore the responsibilities of a modern scientific and industrial civilization. That's what the environmentalist movement, that's what the hippies, that's what Wall Street, all of that. The one thing they all have in common is they ignore the responsibilities of a modern scientific and industrial society. You do that long enough, we're all going to have to go back to figuring out how to farm our land again. And none of us actually know how to do that. Because we were raised and developed as people in an environment of an advanced scientific and technological industrial ecosystem. It was part of our culture. And we have to get back to understanding what that means. That's the big component here. The big component Trump's going to have to do is that massive reindustrialization. So it's not about consumer goods. A lot of the consumer goods can be probably produced by robotics. It's great. And people will repair and maintain the robots and the electrical power systems and the cooling systems and all the things that are needed will maintain a lot of jobs. But the real question is, are you building the infrastructure that sustains that? And that has to be rebuilt. New York subway has to be completely rebuilt. The BART system in San Francisco was built in like 1971. It's 55 years old. It's a pathetic joke. It needs to be completely rebuilt. It needed to be rebuilt 25 years ago. And they weren't even starting the process because we just completely left all of this off. We said, and it's basically debt. You're basically handing an increasingly, it's not just we have $70 trillion of debt in this country, to rebuild all the structures, another like 30 trillion. It's crazy. So, but that's what building a civilization is in a modern scientific and industrial society. This is what culture is. This is what responsibility, this is what moral responsibility looks like. And that's what we've got to redevelop within our political and national culture. And if we do it here, other nations will also adopt it. And we'll see that our young people become increasingly more bright-eyed, excited, and optimistic, because the world will seem rational again. It won't seem like it's a breaking down, decaying shithole, which is what a lot of young people look at the world in our country today and go, this is a shithole and it sucks. And we should rebuild it.
Well, that's a good portrayal of the future. I wondered if you have time to offer comment on this idea of real estate, people buying homes down and looking for them to appreciate and trying to take care of it. And then it reverts to who knows who. But the idea of property in the midst of
I mean, the problem is that housing has become an investment, a financial investment, not the building up of a home or a homestead. So if we were really smart, we would be building homes that could be refurbished, and that the children who were raised in them would almost want to refurbish them and continue to live in them. They would be multi-generational homes. This is kind of what the brownstones are like in New York or Chicago. If you ever go there or look it up, these brownstones are like 3 or 4 story buildings that a family might be able to purchase, but you would have the grandparents and the teenagers all in the same place, multi-generational, and you would, remodel them, refurbish them, but they could be a homestead in an urban environment, but a beautiful, beautiful place to raise a family for many generations. That would be, I think, the ideal. But even if we go to you buy a home, you live in it, you raise your kids, and you move out, you sell it kind of approach that we have today. If you look at the neighborhoods that have been built in the last 30 or 40 years, increasingly they have become homogenous. Where if you go to housing that was built in the 30s and 40s and 50s, you'll find that the neighborhoods where each house was built a little bit differently. And so you walk into the neighborhood and it's kind of this eclectic, nice neighborhood. It's distinct. It has character to it. It doesn't look like a cookie cutter factory printed houses really quickly that all look the same, and you can't even tell one house from the next. So the old story goes, Bob came home from work and he ended up, coming into the house and kissing, John's wife, because he didn't realize it wasn't his house. They all look the same. You can't tell. So the reason why that's happening is because housing is not just an investment for you. Housing is an investment for the entire financial community. And so that financial community, if they're going to invest and buy up these mortgages in the secondary market, they want to know that the houses are all pretty much the same. So whether it's in Michigan or Texas or California or New Jersey, the houses won't be that much different, because the financial guys on Wall Street and the insurance firms that kind of deal with these derivatives and secondary financial contracts have set the guidelines of what mortgages, or even from the developers.
So they make house ripping a big thing.
Well, yeah, but say the developer wants to get backing, or he wants to sell off the ownership of all these houses before they're even sold to individuals, and he wants to sell that to a grouping. They all want to know that everything's the same. So that's true with the housing developments. It's true with all of the plazas or the suburban shopping malls. They're all built the same way wherever you go, for the reason because they're all then sold off in the secondary market by pieces. And so a piece from Atlanta and a piece from Detroit and a piece from Houston and a piece from Oregon will all be jammed into a financial product, but yet the people have been assured by the lawyers that all of those properties are practically the same. And so you've financialized, not just so that it's an investment for the person, like Keisha's saying, the house flipping, but it's also it's an investment in the entire financial system, which has homogenized everything to turn the consumer into a robot. Right? You can go into a Home Depot and you can, it's the same all over the country. You know exactly where everything is. So
Right.
where, there used to be a fight. I got an email today. There used to be a fight where I think it was, I forget which congressman it was, who actually described chain stores to be equivalent to European fascism, monopoly, like a European monopoly in fascism, where you're just, instead, why should a store that sells furniture or sells lumber and construction equipment, why should any company get to have monopoly control on the distribution of that across the country? Or now we have 3 companies when there should be 3,000. There should be regional shops that are based in the region that have their own characteristics. Now, that's probably down the list, pretty far down the list in terms of priorities. But that used to be something that American politicians were addressing in the 1940s, because they saw that once you let everything become homogenized, well, then all of the actual cultural fabric of the country just gets to be destroyed, because local, regional cultures aren't creating the things that they need to function within their cultural region. Some corporation is deciding what all of them are going to have and imposing that on them. So these tendencies, this cultural fabric isn't coming up. But put that aside, I mean, we've allowed everything to become too financialized, and we've lost that eclectic. And it's not surprising if you buy a home in one of those eclectic neighborhoods built in the 1940s with a park and a local elementary school and a little main street, that house will maintain financial value far better than the cookie cutter housing development houses will, because people want to live in those neighborhoods where it's human and natural, and a lot of old trees, because they didn't cut them all down to build the houses, because you wanted to build a new house, but you wanted trees around it. So, I mean, in some cases, the trees got old because you planted them then, but I mean, that's the way that people would think about building houses. And those neighborhoods last a lot longer, and they maintain their value. So it's in the face of this whole financial question, but it's not just a question of financial profit or maintaining financial value of the home. It's literally homogenizing it for insurance practices. And that's where the whole thing has become absurd.
Another factor in that is how are the values set? I mean, we're talking about the house flipping and what constitute the values. I know a big problem right now is people who are buying homes. Someone can arbitrarily say, yeah, my home price value, whatever, is $330,000, but somebody else has come out back and said, well, we actually value your home at $250,000. Well, so people can't even afford the homes anymore because there's inflationary values that are being put on the homes.
Right. And then you get the Blackstones and the BlackRocks, and they start buying up homes, and it just becomes, it's all become insane. Yeah.
You have,
Keisha, I think I'm done.
You done? All right.
I'm done. Yeah, I'm exhausted. I had a pretty bad cold last week, and that's why I wasn't on last Monday, but this has been a great discussion.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everyone, for being on, and check out the website, contribute, help us to get this material out there and this discussion going within the population. All right. So appreciate all your support and the discussion. Talk to y'all on next week.